Rising up, B50 in the streets. I took my time, I took my glances. Good afternoon, welcome back to Turbo Tortoise Tech. My name is XXL, and in this review I have got my grubby little paws on a B550M from MSI and the 3600 XT, because I think, well, I've assumed, and apparently assumed correctly, that this will be a very good combo for gaming and for development and for architectural work and any sort of multi-threaded processing that you would want to do. I just didn't think it would be as good as it is. But before we get into performance or anything like that, I want to just talk a little bit about this motherboard, because I think MSI has really gone in the right direction with these mid-range boards in a couple of very critical and key areas. One of them being the port setup that is on the back of this motherboard. So there's a 2.5 gigabit LAN, there's a PS2 port for overclocking and BIOS interrupts as well. You can automatically flash your BIOS directly from this, and then it has a display port and an HDMI. And why have they put that on there? Because of the APUs that AMD is making. As we saw in the news earlier in the week, the 4750G is as good as a 3700 XT in multi-threaded, well, nearly, and then it still has an APU on it that pretty much destroys a GT 1030. So you can get a complete environment or development environment or something to that effect, video editing, like architectural work, that sort of stuff on that APU now. And with a board like this having HDMI and DisplayPort, you can then run 144Hz or 4K monitors from that as well. So you've got everything in a really nice, small, compact little product. The board, I mean, itself, a full ATX or EATX would come down to here. EATX extends a little bit further down. If you need an example of that, the Z490 review, I had a EATX. That was definitely an EATX, as it were. But this little board here in question is really nicely put together. It's got an isolated sound card that's pretty clean. I did have a little jam out to it with it yesterday, which was quite fun, and it worked extremely well. Good audio positioning as well. A little bit too warm, honestly, on the DAC, which is rarely a complaint from me. I don't like overly digitalized sounds where it's like too crisp and almost sounds like you're listening to a literal cat on a hot tin roof. This was on the opposite end. It's a bit warm, and unfortunately there isn't any control over the EQ or anything like that, because it's a basic Realtek setup, but it did its job very well, and it's still got things like optical out and 7.1 support. So it's still a full proper, you know, sound card, just maybe with a little less bells and whistles on the software end of things. But speaking of software in this motherboard, Dragon Center once again is an absolute champ. When I do these setups, I have an SSD with everything, well, almost everything that I need on it, and I've just sysprep that SSD so that it's like a fresh Windows install, but with all of my programs installed, so I can do drivers and stuff after the fact. And then in MSI Dragon Center, you literally just go to your update and support section and click download, and it just installs all the drivers and stuff for you. So that was more of the same, which is really, really nice. 10 out of 10 there. As far as the board goes, I mean, there's fan headers all over around the sides of the motherboard, plenty of JRGB as well, so you can make it look bling, as it were. You've got a dedicated audio out that's also on the isolated sound card portion of the motherboard that goes to the front. You've got headers for extra USBs. You've got a USB 3 and a 3.1 header for the front of your case as well. And then there are 6 SATA connections on the board and 2 M.2s, which is really nice because it's going to take advantage of that PCI Express 4.0 technology. So moving on then to performance. Now, I've had the 10400F before, as I said, and I put it on the Z490 25,000 Rand motherboard. This is obviously nowhere near that in price. So it should theoretically be a non-compete as far as desktop performance and that sort of stuff goes. Well, the CPU makes a massive difference in that. But this 3600 XT was so good as a processor in multi-threaded, it was almost as good as an old 1800X. My old 1800X used to score generally between 1680 and low 1700s. This got to 1634 on the multi-threaded on Cinebench R15. And even if, oh, sorry. This got, frog in my throat. Well, even in R20, it didn't do like badly in multi-threaded. It still kept up its multi-threaded performance, and it was so good. It was almost scratching at the heels of much higher processors, 8 cores with just a 16 core 12 thread. And then in single core, to my surprise, it beat a 10700K overclock. Now the 10700K that I only had a Hyper 212, or I only used a Hyper 212 as my general cooling platform, just for testing to see how far you can push it with something decent on. And if you notice, this board doesn't have that on, because your boy did a oops and gave the brackets and stuff that I needed back to Cooler Master, so they will return those. So I might do some extra overclocking and playing around with that setup later over the weekend, and maybe release some more info on it next week. But just with this cooler and me having a mess around, I did have a go at some overclocking, and for the first time, multi-threaded actually was worse when I overclocked than when it was compared to just leaving XFR to do its own thing. Now this cooler is, I would say, a little bit under spec, well, more than a little bit, because when I had the overclock at 4.25 all-core, it was hitting a very impressive 97 degrees, but it didn't thermal throttle, which is kind of interesting. And the ambient temperatures around the board and stuff didn't actually increase. It was mostly centered around the CPU socket temp and stuff didn't spike as hard as that had. But moving on to gaming, the setups are identical. They both had literally the exact same RAM, SSD and GPU. So those haven't changed, and then power supply, of course, which is a bit irrelevant. This is a 900 watt, in case you're wondering, so there's more than enough current being supplied for these sort of tasks. And the bullet points of the presentation is the 10400F is a very, very good gaming chip, but I still give the win overall to AMD. Even though this chip costs 1,500 and more, the motherboard architecture is where AMD just has been winning. If you were to buy a B550 or X570 now, you could just upgrade to the 4000 series when that becomes available. Whereas with the Intel, you're going to have to buy a whole nother setup. So your cost implication over time with AMD might be a bit more upfront, but in the long term, it does look, well, it's obviously going to be a lot better. If we just take like X370 and B350 as an example, those kept their legs all the way into the early 3000 or the 3000 series were supported on those motherboards. So that was 3 releases worth of processors that were supported. So now with the B550 and the X570 being that move up into the 4000 series or 3000 series only, and then now 4000 series, that's where they're going to start support, then you could assume quite safely that AMD will support the 5000 series on the AM4 platform. And it's because of that that I give the overall win to AMD, and it did produce some very interesting results. Where I thought it would be a dead heat, the AMD was slightly behind some areas, and things like CSGO, where I assumed it would be actually an Intel win, it then became an AMD win, which is very, very strange. It's almost like they've switched places. Another one that struck me as a bit like how was the Firestrike simultaneous physics and GPU test. And this had generally been a weak point for AMDs, and I saw them really dropping off. The CPU tests, they always did very well, but it seemed like when it was doing gaming instructions and physics instructions simultaneously, that it would just suddenly tank, which was odd, right? And now it's kind of role reversed. So while these CPUs are almost identical in gaming performance, the AMD pulls ahead slightly in multi-threaded workloads, and I think that's down to their optimization of their cache delivery to the CPU. Another thing I wanted to touch on as well is because I don't have the Hyper 212 on this, which is a much bigger cooler. I mean, here it is here, right? This is quite a lot more copper. I mean, if I just even hold it next to that, it's quite a lot more surface area, and then obviously it has a bigger fan and a much more polished contact area. Yes, I've left my thermal paste on it because it's expensive. I'm going to just keep taking thermal paste or put Cooler Master. So I'll just put a blob on the next thing that I put on, and it's always done its job very admirably. To its credit though, the 10400F does run very, very cool. I only managed to get it to 45 degrees, but you can't overclock it, you can't modify it in any way. And if you put water cooling on the 3600 XT, it would get even better than the scores I have now, probably by about 5 to 10%. So even, I would say, even with that cooler on, it'll probably be even 5% faster, and then in which case it starts beating out the Intel. Now, like I said, the Intel is 4,000 Rand and this is 5.5, but that was on a 25,000 Rand motherboard. I don't think you need that to get the most performance out of a 10400F, let's be honest. But that really seems to be the limitation of their die size, is down to 6-core 12-thread. Anytime it goes over that, the temperatures get ludicrous and the thermal throttling is out of control. Their thermal headrooms are also just not as good as AMD, and it was proved in that with the 3600 XT. When I did the 4.25 running at 97 degrees, it still didn't thermal throttle. Whereas the Intel, once you hit about 70-75, it starts to step back its clock. And yes, some might argue that it does increase the longevity, and of course it does if it's running cooler, but I doubt you would be buying a 5 to 10,000 Rand processor and not spending like 10% of that 500-600 Rand on a really good air-based cooler like the Hyper 212. The last thing to note is the SSD performance. I did actually notice that the write cycles were better on the new PCI Express revision. So my SSD actually had much better small size write files, and that's actually where the major differences come in between SSDs. It's not on the bigger file sizes, it's actually on the smaller ones. So the quoted speeds that they give out are for large file transfers. The small file transfers are much harder to do because it has to open, do the action, and then close it, right? So there's more instructions in between, and therefore it takes longer to accomplish. So all in all then though, the combination of this B550 plus 3600 XT is really good. And if you're not needing multi-threaded, as I've shown with things like 3300X and 3100, those are also good. It's not to say that Intel isn't an option, it is, and if you ancestrally like Intel, I can understand why you would want to get it. The reason I would say that you should go in this direction is just because of the longevity of your platform, and that if you want to upgrade, it is going to be much cheaper to do so. So thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this review. We do have our little competition culminating tomorrow, so if you aren't liked and subscribed on any of our platforms, just to go ahead, that's literally all you have to do to entry. Our birthday of 2 years is next month, and we'll be two next month. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming along with me on this journey and for supporting the channel. It's very much appreciated. Until then, keep well, stay safe, and I'll see you on the flip side.